A link to my Voidwalker build and timestamps are included in the description below. The Voidwalker subclass has always had a special place in my heart. Whenever the words space magic were uttered, my brain always immediately imagined myself chucking around Nova bombs and tossing vortex grenades. Even while raiding in D1, when the majority went with the safe and sensible choice of Sunsinger and Fireborn, I preferred to straight up obliterate my enemies with the destructive power of the Void. Fast forward to today, December of 2021, we now have actual in-depth build crafting to take these subclasses to new heights. In the 30th Anniversary 3.40 patch, Bungie removed the cost to apply mods to our gear and opened up the API so that third-party apps like Destiny Item Manager can now properly save and apply loadouts, mods, and all. This patch also introduced the variable ability cooldown system, which completely separated each and every ability into their own specific cooldown based upon their effective power level and usage. In a nutshell, this means when it comes to the new cooldowns, weak abilities come back fast, strong abilities come back slow. Let's see how these changes impacted Voidwalker and, in what is my opinion, the best exotic to pair with it, Contraverse Hold. If you're new to the channel, and I'm going to go out on a limb and assume the majority of you are, then a like, comment, and a sub would be greatly appreciated, if and only if you enjoy the content. Alright, first let's take a look at top treed Voidwalker specific changes. The Entropic Pull melee had its base cooldown duration increased from 82 seconds to 90 seconds. 8 seconds or just shy of a 10% longer cooldown isn't too terribly bad, as we don't tend to rely upon our melee, especially in Legend and Master level content. In my experience, this increase isn't really noticeable, and that was the only top tree specific change. For middle tree Voidwalker, aka Nova Warp, the Atomic Breach melee also had its cooldown duration increased from 82 to 90 seconds. Handheld Supernova received another PvE damage buff with increased damage versus champions and bosses by 30%. It also received reduced damage versus players in PvP, so it can no longer one-shot as it deals 150 damage max. The projectile range was increased to 12 meters to 14 meters, and increased push physics impulse strength. And I translated this to being a bigger knockback effect, which translates into increased flinch for enemies. Dark Matter now scales energy gains based on the enemy type, but with reduced energy gain for player kills. It now grants 15% melee, 10% grenade, and 10% class ability energy for killing a player. The Nova Warp Super also received another PvE damage buff with increased damage versus champions and bosses by 30%. That's it for the specific changes to those two trees. Now on to bottom tree Voidwalker, and the only change here was that the Devour melee was reduced in cooldown from 82 to 75 seconds. Alright, now for the Voidwalker grenades. So Scatter Grenade cooldown was increased from 82 to 105 seconds. That's a 28% increase, with a 15% damage buff in PvE. Vortex Grenades also went from 82 to 105, with the same 15% damage buff in PvE. The initial detonation damage was also reduced from 50 to 20. Axion Bolts, which I find to be the weakest grenade option, but they received the most substantial buff of the three grenades. Their cooldown was only increased from 82 to 91, just over an 11% increase. They received the same 15% damage buff in PvE. They also received increased bolt tracking, search radius by 33%, increased bolt movement speed by 10%, and bolt travel distance by 15%. So a rather substantial buff overall to their effectiveness. However, due to the nature of being a bolt-type grenade, they're still the weakest choice in PvE. I could see a case for using them in a bottom tree Devour build, but even then I'd still rather use the Vortex grenades. Next up is the supers. The regen speed now varies per super, with Nova Bomb finding itself in tier 3, which is a 6 minute and 23 second cooldown at tier 10. Nova Warp is in tier 2, which is a 7 minute and 5 second cooldown at tier 10. Okay, so that covers all the changes to the Voidwalker subclasses. Next, let's look at the exotic Contraverse Hold. So now the ability generation boost always lasts for 1.75 seconds. Previously, the boost would range between 1 second and 4 seconds, with the average duration being 1.35. So overall, this is a net gain, and it just makes the regen consistent, which is much easier to build around now that we can count on how much we're going to get back. And we can throw out those worst and best case scenarios. If you're playing bottom tree Devour, you're most likely either using Nezarec, Sin, or Nothing Manacles, or maybe a neutral exotic, all of which remain unchanged. Okay. All of those numbers are nice and all, but what does it all mean, Basil? First, let's get Middle Tree out of the way. I appreciate what Bungie's doing here and that they're really giving Nova Warp some love in PvE, but at its core, it just isn't built to excel in harder content. And in the easier content, you can already use whatever build you want and do fine, so I'm not really sure what they're going for here. Due to the nature of handheld Supernova being a short-range attack, it doesn't lend itself well to harder content where you don't want to be right up in your enemies' faces. And even with the damage increase, it still doesn't do enough to warrant going toe-to-toe with a crazed Overload Minotaur champion who's charging at you like you just stole his younger sister's lunch money. The extra knockback and stun is noticeable, but I still think a charged Vortex Grenade, which will also stun on the initial explosion but do much more total damage, is still the play. Nova Warp's beefy 30% damage buff against champions and bosses was welcome, but against those enemies you really want burst damage from your super, and due to it being a roaming super, it's never going to be enough to accomplish what a well-timed Nova Bomb can against a stunned champion. With knockback still being a thing, it's not ideal having to get into a boss's face and slowly explode over and over again when you can just toss a Nova Bomb that does a ton of damage and lets you get back to shooting your high DPS weapons. So yes, while I was able to use Nova Warp to clear legendary lost sectors, it's still much less effective than either top or bottom tree in PvE. Okay, and now for top tree, which in my opinion is the creme de la creme. So the build I run changes slightly based on the activity and whether or not I need to run champion mods. In general, I like to run a grenade kickstart mod, but in a legendary lost sector, I might have to run 2 champion mods if I'm not running either Divinity or Ariana's Vow, for instance. So this build can be taken and tweaked depending upon personal preference, which weapons and champion mods you need to run, etc. It revolves around spamming those overcharged Vortex Grenades, and has incredible survivability thanks to the damage reduction from both Contraverse Hold and Protective Light. I really like the change to Contraverse Hold now, having consistent regen. I can't think of another perk in the game that had RNG built into how well it works, so I'm glad this was normalized. Yeah, there were times it worked in your favor, but now that we can look at exactly how much grenade energy we're getting back, we can make informed decisions on which other mods and how much discipline we want to run to get that infinite grenade loop going. I found that with just 9 discipline and double bomber that I was easily getting my entire grenade back before even picking up any wells. Because of the cooldown that Contraverse Hold has, charged Vortex Grenades are still the play. Due to how long they last, they can proc the energy return twice. You still need to be thoughtful about placing your grenade, so this means hitting an enemy with the initial explosion, which will start the cooldown on Contraverse, but then you need those last couple of ticks to damage an enemy so that it procs the energy return a second time. So what I do is throw my grenade at the beefiest enemy in the room, because I know they'll stay alive long enough to proc the energy return twice. Another safe bet is throwing a grenade at an area such as a choke point or a spawn point where a large number of enemies are walking through, and this will also guarantee you proc the energy return twice. I mentioned earlier that the initial impact of the grenade was nerfed from 50 to 20, so that is a 3/5 reduction in that initial explosion, which seems rather large, but the initial explosion was only about 20% of the total damage, with the majority coming from the 16 damage ticks that follow. Now the initial explosion only accounts for 9% of the total damage, and combined with the 15% overall damage increase, we actually see a 3% buff in the total damage, with the damage now being more evenly distributed throughout the duration of the grenade. A welcome change in my book. If you're able to hit tier 10 discipline at a grenade kickstart mod or even both, then you'll have absolutely no problem infinitely looping your charged Vortex Grenades. You can run Demolitionist on your weapon to help cover for bad grenade throws, you can even drop Protective Light entirely if you're feeling especially confident, or in easier content of course. And then you can swap in another Elemental Ordnance mod to spawn 3 wells with each grenade kill. The other half of the build is of course Nova Bomb, and having a high damage instant cast super that can delete champions and dish out huge bursts on bosses is something that can't be replaced. I didn't do any specific testing of the super cooldown changes, but after reviewing my gameplay, I rather like the addition of gaining energy just from taking and dealing damage. And you can see right here, I gain a huge chunk of super energy just from some primary fire. And overall, I felt I had my super up even faster than before, regardless of the much slower base cooldown. I also like not having the cooldown as reliant on the intellect stat, meaning I can dedicate a larger portion of my stat budget to recovery and discipline, which both help a lot more in the moment-to-moment gameplay loop. In endgame PvE, you don't typically spam your super the moment it comes off cooldown, because you want to use it at opportune times, such as on a champion, or a boss, or a particularly huge group of adds. And now the conclusion. The 28% longer cooldown on Vortex grenades and the changes to Contraverse Hold did not hurt this build in the slightest. There are a lot of different ways you can run it, but you'll definitely want to dedicate yourself to it entirely, which means at the very least aiming for tier 9 or 10 discipline, and then at least 2 other regen sources such as Bomber, Grenade Kickstart, Demolitionist, or Elemental Wells. Bungie is finally leaning in hard on build crafting, which as an RPG fan I absolutely love. I can't wait to see what kind of crazy builds we'll be able to conjure up when Void 3.0 launches with Witch Queen. Thanks for tuning in. Next up, I'm going to take a look at the changes to bottom